name is ETHEL TUNGOHAN. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and a Canada Research Chair in Canadian Migration Policy, Impacts, and Activism at York University. And my research interests look at the experiences of newcomers and immigrants. And this current research project analyzes the experiences of Asian international students during COVID using focus groups and one-on-one interviews, and also analyzes the discourses that come into play during this time.
I'm JP CATUNGAL. I'm an assistant professor in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. And I'm also affiliated with the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Ethel TUNGOHAN and I are collaborators on this project that looks at the experiences of Asian international students and how they have been figured or not in formal, institutional, and media discourses about COVID-19. And part of the goal of this work is to situate the ongoing experiences of international students, Asian international students, during COVID-19 within the longer history of the figuration of Asians in the Canadian context as racialized subjects who experience kind of paradoxical forms of belonging in relation to the Canadian body politic.
I think our research can best be situated by looking at the figure of the Asian migrant. We argue that Asian international students can be seen as a subset of Asian migrants, and there's been a long history of looking at Asian migrants both skeptically but also acceptingly, right? And in terms of kind of media discourses surrounding the presence of Asian international students, we find that some of the experiences of non-belonging that Asian international students are facing as a result of COVID harkens back to even in 2008 when Maclean's magazine had that article asking, are universities too Asian, right? So one of the things that we are discovering in terms of these histories is that Asian international students, like a lot of Asian migrants, are seen as being both good and bad. And in some ways, it almost feels as though they're grudgingly tolerated. Universities like Asian international students, obviously because of the tuition they bring, but then in times of crisis, such as the pandemic, it's almost like the mantle of belonging is yanked back.
There's a lot of histories that come to be refigured and resurfaced during COVID times, particularly in relation to the place of people of Asian descent in the Canadian nation state. With Asian international students, there is this history that is being resurfaced of, again, the conditional kinds of belonging that emplace Asians within the Canadian polity in a particular way, paradoxically both as bringing in value, being appreciated for historically labor, but more recently as sources of capital, but also still labor, but then also continually being figured as a threat to the vitality of the Canadian nation state. The 2010 Maclean's article is the 10th year anniversary during COVID times later this year, right? Brings all of that together, the anti-Asianness that has been happening, certainly in Vancouver and Toronto. This has been visible and very public. Because this research deals with, at least partly, Asian international students' experiences of during COVID-19 in their universities and beyond, the relationship between international students and the university also becomes, part of that question. Like it's spotlighted in a particular way, and that is kind of put through culturally situated understandings of health. For example, we're talking about, say, stress or anxiety or other mental health impacts of COVID-19, some of our participants have expressed worry that this would affect their standing in the university, right? And therefore, right, their fears of being kicked out, of being punished for speaking out about their own experiences, right? That is very much also part of this, their lived experience of COVID-19 is this very real perception that they have something to fear, right? And so there is a certain kind of emotional management that we've seen in the interviews and focus groups that we've had. Vulnerabilities, there are a lot. Some of it pre-exists, many of it pre-exists COVID-19, right? I've already mentioned the kind of long histories through which Asians, whether citizens or not, whatever their relationship is to the Canadian nation state, are figured in particular ways, in really racialized ways, as bodies, as laborers, as sources of capital, potential model minorities, and these other kinds of subject positions that are racialized within a kind of white settler society. COVID-19 has really surfaced, has really exaggerated or made very visible a lot of these long histories, right? In the Vancouver context, and this is true also to a certain extent in the Toronto context, certainly within the university, but in Greater Vancouver more broadly, the discourse of crazy rich Asians taking over the economy, the real estate market, and the university, right? Much to the detriment of everyone else being usually coded as Canadian citizens, subcoded as white. This is part of the picture of vulnerability that would be important to understand when we tackle the kinds of narratives that Asian international students offer during the interviews.
And I think one of the other challenges is the fact that they feel that they lack a support network. As we've already mentioned, although Asian Canadianness bleeds into these narratives as well, what makes it difficult for international students is simply the fact that for a lot of them, they live in residence. They don't really have a lot of supports. Some of them live by themselves. So at the height of the lockdown, I've had students saying, it's just been an increase in stress that they've experienced, right? There's been an increase in anxiety. Some have shared that their grades plummeted, right? Some have shared that they're distraught because they came to Canada because they wanted to have that cultural exchange, but you can't really do that when everything is through online learning. And I think what's really interesting as well are the mental health challenges that they're facing as a result of the microaggressions that they're experiencing as they navigate through different spaces. Perhaps Professor CATUNGAL and I need to reflect on is how the use of a mask can be seen as a marker of Asianness. Some of our respondents have shared, I'm not sure whether we're getting funny looks because we're wearing a mask or because our faces are Asian, and this was more so in the beginning of the pandemic, but because they were aware of the pandemic before Canadians were even aware of this, some people were wearing masks before other Canadians were wearing it, and some have shared fraught experiences where shopkeepers would actually be like, get out, you're wearing a mask, you're scaring customers. So then it's like, so some of them are sharing, are they mad at us because we're wearing a mask, or are they mad at us because we're Asian and wearing a mask? So it's hard to kind of disentangle that.
One thing that I've also noticed in the interviews so far is that the very specter, the very possibility of being attacked is itself incredibly anxiety causing. Whether or not people have themselves experienced microaggressions or physical attacks, the possibility that it will happen itself exerts such a force on their capacity to be in the everyday. Right? And this is part of what hate crimes do. It's not individual, it targets a community. The rise of anti-Asian racism during COVID-19, right, affects international students in that way, right? Is through making it a looming specter, a presence that's atmospheric. So international students, negotiate that through the kinds of affects that they feel in their body, this kind of hyper surveillance of their surroundings, isolating themselves even more so, the fear that they might experience if and when they are in public spaces. There's another kind of embodied vulnerability, a vulnerability that sticks very close and is like lived in and through the body.